The interview had already begun long before she realized anyone was watching. The steady drip echoed through the luxury apartment with the stubborn rhythm of a clock counting down invisible seconds. Drip, drip, drip. Naomi Brooks paused just inside the open doorway, clutching the worn leather folder that held every resume she had printed over the past 3 months. She had expected polished marble floors, expensive artwork, and the distant view of downtown Chicago stretching beyond floor-to-ceiling windows. She had not expected silence. The apartment felt strangely lived in despite its elegance. A navy jacket rested neatly across the back of a chair. A mug of black coffee sat half-finished beside an open notebook. Sunlight poured through the windows, catching tiny dust particles floating lazily through the air. Somewhere deeper inside, water continued falling into metal with quiet persistence. Naomi glanced at the text message on her phone one last time. Apartment 4207. Interview at exactly 9 a.m. Please ring once. She checked the time. 8:59. Right on schedule. The man who opened the door looked nothing like the Billionaire magazines loved to photograph. Adrian Carter wore a charcoal sweater with rolled sleeves and dark jeans instead of an expensive tailored suit. At 39, the CEO of Carter Urban Development carried himself with calm confidence rather than flashy authority. His expression remained unreadable, though his dark eyes studied Naomi with careful attention before stepping aside. "Ms. Brooks?" he asked. "Yes, sir. Come in." His voice was steady, almost casual. "Make yourself comfortable. I just need 1 minute." Naomi nodded politely, holding her folder against her chest as Adrian disappeared down a hallway without another word. The apartment became quiet again except for the dripping water. She stood awkwardly near the entrance, uncertain whether to sit or remain standing. Her interview clothes were simple but spotless, a navy blouse carefully pressed the night before and slacks that had been altered twice over the years to keep them looking presentable. She had polished her shoes before sunrise while her 7-year-old son, Ethan, still slept in the small apartment they shared across town. Missing this interview wasn't an option. Rent was due in 11 days. Ethan's asthma prescription needed to be refilled before Friday. Every dollar already had a purpose waiting for it. Drip, drip, drip. Naomi slowly turned toward the kitchen. The sound was impossible to ignore now that everything else had fallen silent. A chrome faucet above an oversized farmhouse sink released one stubborn drop every few seconds. Each tiny splash landed against stainless steel with mechanical precision. She stared at it longer than she intended. Most people probably wouldn't have noticed. Or if they had, they would have assumed someone else would deal with it. Naomi had spent too many years maintaining aging apartment buildings not to recognize the sound immediately. A worn cartridge, probably. Maybe a loose washer if the fixture was older than it looked. 5 minutes now could become a flooded cabinet 6 months later. She hesitated. This wasn't her home. It certainly wasn't her job. But the instinct refused to leave. She quietly set her folder on the kitchen island before looking around. "Mr. Carter?" she called gently. No answer. Another drip landed. Naomi exhaled softly. "Old habits," she whispered to herself with the faintest smile. Opening the cabinet beneath the sink, she wasn't surprised to find a small toolbox tucked neatly beside cleaning supplies. Whoever organized this apartment appreciated order. She carefully removed an adjustable wrench and crouched beside the plumbing, moving with practiced efficiency born from years of fixing problems, because waiting for someone else had never been an affordable luxury. Upstairs, hidden behind a partially closed office door overlooking the kitchen, Adrian Carter lowered the tablet, displaying Naomi's resume. Instead, he watched the security monitor showing the woman kneeling beside his sink. She hadn't called for help. She hadn't complained about the noise. She hadn't looked around to see if anyone might reward her for what she was doing. She simply noticed something broken and quietly decided it mattered. Adrian leaned back in his chair without saying a word. After 43 interviews, for the first time, someone had failed the interview exactly the way he had hoped. Naomi tightened the final fitting with careful precision before slowly turning the faucet handle. Water rushed out in a smooth stream, clear and steady, before she shut it off again. Silence settled over the kitchen. No drip, no metallic tapping, just stillness. She smiled almost unconsciously, wiped the small bead of water from the chrome surface with a paper towel, and returned the adjustable wrench to the toolbox exactly where she had found it. She closed the cabinet gently, picked up her folder, and had barely taken 2 steps back toward the living room when Adrian Carter appeared in the hallway. His expression revealed nothing, but his eyes moved briefly toward the sink before returning to her face. "I hope you do not mind," Naomi said immediately, a faint flush rising to her cheeks. "I noticed the leak. I found a wrench under the sink. I should have asked first. I apologize if I overstepped." Adrian looked at the faucet for another second before asking, "Does it still leak?" Naomi shook her head. "No, sir." "How do you know?" "Because I replaced the worn cartridge seal. It was beginning to crack. If it had stayed that way much longer, moisture probably would have started collecting beneath the cabinet." Adrian walked to the sink, turned the handle on, then off again. The apartment remained perfectly quiet. He rested one hand on the counter without taking his eyes off the faucet. "You recognize the problem that quickly? You hear enough leaking faucets over the years. They all start sounding familiar." Adrian slowly turned toward her. "Your resume says you worked in residential property operations." 8 years. "Office management." Naomi smiled softly. "Mostly whatever needed to be done." Adrian gestured toward the dining table overlooking the skyline. "Please have a seat." Naomi sat carefully, placing her folder neatly in front of her. Adrian remained standing for a moment, studying her in thoughtful silence before finally taking the chair across from her. There were no interview panels, no assistant taking notes, no laptop displaying standardized questions. Only a notebook, 2 coffee mugs, and the morning sunlight stretching across the polished wooden table. Adrian folded his hands. "Why did you fix it?" Naomi blinked. "The faucet?" "Yes." She hesitated, clearly surprised that this would be the first interview question. "Because it needed to be fixed." Adrian waited. Naomi looked down briefly before continuing. "I know that probably sounds too simple. Go on." "When something small gets ignored, it usually becomes something expensive later. Water damage, mold, rot. People think they are saving time by walking away, but they are usually just delaying a bigger problem." Adrian wrote one short line in his notebook. "You were not hired to repair my apartment." "No, sir." "You are here applying for an executive operations position." "Yes." "So why spend your first few minutes doing maintenance instead of preparing for the interview?" Naomi thought carefully before answering. "Because I was already preparing." Adrian raised an eyebrow. "How?" "The job description says your company develops affordable housing communities. Operations is about noticing problems before everyone else does. Whether it is a leaking faucet or a struggling employee, someone has to care enough to stop and look." The room fell quiet again. Adrian watched her for several seconds. There was no rehearsed confidence in her voice, no polished corporate language. She spoke the way someone explained a habit rather than defended a strategy. "Did you think fixing the faucet would impress me?" he finally asked. Naomi laughed once, quietly embarrassed. "Honestly, I was hoping you would never notice." That answer lingered between them longer than either expected. Adrian leaned back in his chair. "Most candidates spend the first 5 minutes trying to impress me." Naomi shrugged gently. "I have spent enough years raising my son to know children notice actions more than promises. Adults usually do too." Adrian glanced at the family photograph tucked inside the corner of her resume. Ethan stood beside her wearing a bright blue baseball cap several sizes too large, both of them laughing at something outside the camera frame. "How old is your son now?" Adrian asked. 7. "Who is watching him today?" "My neighbor, Mrs. Evelyn Turner. She says interviews deserve lucky breakfasts, so she insisted on making him pancakes before school." A genuine smile almost escaped Adrian before he caught himself. Lucky breakfasts. She believes syrup fixes anxiety. Adrian chuckled softly. "Does it?" Naomi smiled back. "It helps a little." Adrian closed his notebook without another question. For the first time in months, he realized he had completely forgotten the list of carefully prepared interview questions waiting beside him. None of them suddenly seemed important. Across the table sat a woman who had quietly revealed more about her character in 15 minutes than most executives managed in 15 years. Yet even as respect quietly replaced curiosity, another thought settled into Adrian's mind. If Naomi Brooks was exactly the kind of leader his company desperately needed, convincing everyone else would become far more difficult than finding her. Naomi thanked Adrian for his time, gathered her folder, and walked toward the elevator with the quiet composure of someone who had learned long ago not to measure hope by first impressions. The polished elevator doors closed softly, carrying her toward the lobby 42 floors below. Only when the numbers began counting downward did she allow herself a slow breath. She replayed every answer in her mind, wondering if she had sounded too honest, too practical, or simply too ordinary for a position that most people would spend years chasing. Her phone buzzed before she reached the ground floor. A text from Mrs. Evelyn Turner appeared on the screen. Ethan got 100% on his spelling quiz. He says you are going to get the job because you fixed something before breakfast. Naomi laughed quietly to herself. Children always found the simplest explanations for life. She replied with a heart emoji before slipping the phone back into her purse and disappearing into the busy Chicago sidewalk, where office workers hurried past carrying coffee cups and briefcases, each person chasing a different version of success. High above the city, Adrian remained seated at the dining table long after the apartment had fallen silent again. He opened the notebook resting beside his coffee mug. Every previous page contained neat columns of observations collected over the past 3 months. Candidate 1. Exceptional credentials. Ignored the leaking faucet. Candidate 8. Complained about maintenance. Candidate 15. Suggested calling building management. Candidate 27. Mentioned the noise 3 separate times, but never stood up. Candidate 34. Asked whether the apartment had been inspected recently. 43 interviews. 43 talented professionals. Not one had reached beneath the sink. Adrian slowly turned to a blank page and wrote only 4 words. She fixed the problem first. He stared at the sentence for several seconds before closing the notebook. His father's voice drifted into memory with surprising clarity. People tell you who they are before they ever introduce themselves. You just have to watch instead of listening. Adrian could still picture Saturday mornings as a boy, riding beside his father in an old pickup truck filled with plumbing tools. Malcolm Carter had spent 32 years repairing broken pipes throughout neighborhoods where few people remembered his name, but everyone remembered that he always came when they needed help. More than once Adrian had watched his father quietly tighten a leaking valve for an elderly widow who could not afford the repair. Every time, she tried to pay. Every time, Malcolm smiled and said, "Just promise me you will help somebody else when it is your turn." Success had carried Adrian into skyscrapers, boardrooms, and billion-dollar negotiations, but somewhere between quarterly earnings reports and shareholder meetings, he had begun relying on resumes instead of character. The leaking faucet had started almost by accident 6 months earlier when a maintenance worker mentioned replacing the cartridge. Adrian had asked him to leave it alone. Since then, that tiny drip had become the first interview question no applicant knew they were answering. His phone vibrated across the table. The caller identification displayed the name Olivia Grant, Chief Human Resources Officer. Adrian answered immediately. "Good morning. Please tell me you finally found someone," Olivia said without preamble. "Operations has been running without a director for almost 4 months." Adrian glanced toward the kitchen sink. "I may have." There was a pause. "May have. I met someone interesting." Olivia laughed knowingly. Interesting usually means complicated. Adrian smiled faintly. "Probably. What does her resume look like?" Adrian looked at Naomi's folder resting on the table. He had barely opened it. "Honestly, I am not sure yet." Silence answered him. "You interviewed someone without reading her resume?" Olivia finally asked. "I read enough." "Adrian, trust me." Olivia sighed. "Those are always expensive words." Adrian leaned back in his chair, his gaze settling on the quiet faucet. "Schedule a leadership review for tomorrow afternoon. I want department heads present." "Already?" "Yes. You know they are expecting someone with Fortune 500 experience." "I know exactly what they are expecting." Olivia lowered her voice. "And does your candidate have it?" Adrian answered without hesitation. "She has something harder to find." After ending the call, he finally opened Naomi's resume for the first time. There were no Ivy League degrees, no executive titles, no glowing headlines. Instead, there were years spent solving practical problems inside aging apartment communities, leading maintenance teams through shrinking budgets, organizing emergency repairs during winter storms, and mentoring young employees who had never been given a second chance. It was an impressive career in ways most corporate recruiters would never notice. Adrian closed the folder slowly. unaware that while he was preparing to defend Naomi before his executive team, someone else inside the company had already begun asking a very different question. Why had the billionaire chief executive officer chosen to interview an unknown single mother inside his private apartment instead of the corporate headquarters? The executive conference room overlooked Lake Michigan through walls of glass that usually inspired confidence. That afternoon, the view went almost unnoticed. 12 department heads sat around the long walnut table, tablets open, coffee untouched, each expecting another discussion about quarterly projections or construction timelines. Instead, Adrian Carter entered carrying only a single manila folder. Olivia Grant noticed immediately. "Where is the presentation?" she asked quietly as everyone settled into their seats. Adrian placed the folder in the center of the table. "We will not need one." A few puzzled glances circled the room. Marcus Holloway, the company's chief financial officer, adjusted his glasses. "You said this meeting concerned the director of operations position." "It does," Adrian replied calmly. "I have selected a candidate." Relief spread briefly across several faces before Marcus asked the obvious question. "Excellent. Which company is she coming from?" Adrian looked around the room before answering. "She is not coming from another executive position." The atmosphere shifted almost instantly. Olivia leaned back slowly, already recognizing the direction of the conversation. Adrian slid the folder toward the middle of the table. "Her name is Naomi Brooks." Several executives opened the resume. Silence lasted barely 5 seconds before eyebrows began rising around the room. "No graduate degree?" someone murmured. Another voice followed. "Property maintenance. Regional housing operations. No Fortune 500 experience." Marcus continued reading before placing the papers back onto the table. "Adrian, this cannot be the complete resume." "It is. Surely there is another version." "There is not." The room remained quiet until Victoria Lawson, Senior Vice President of Development, folded her hands. "She has managed department maintenance teams. We oversee multi-billion-dollar developments across 6 states. Those are not remotely comparable responsibilities." Adrian listened without interrupting. Another executive added, "Our investors expect someone with large-scale corporate leadership. This position requires executive-level decision-making. She has never managed an organization this size." Every objection arrived with calm professionalism, each one grounded in facts rather than arrogance. Adrian knew that made them far more difficult to dismiss. Finally, Marcus looked directly at him. "Why her?" Adrian answered with unusual simplicity. "Because she notices what everyone else ignores." Several confused expressions met his response. Marcus sighed. "That is not an executive qualification." Adrian stood and walked toward the windows before speaking again. "How many of you believe leadership begins with strategy?" Nearly every hand rose. Adrian nodded. "My father believed leadership begins with responsibility." No one spoke. Adrian rarely discussed his personal life inside the company. "Yesterday morning, I interviewed Naomi Brooks in my apartment." Marcus frowned. "Your apartment?" Adrian ignored the interruption. There was a leaking faucet in the kitchen. Olivia smiled almost imperceptibly. She already understood where this was going. Adrian continued. 43 candidates have walked through that apartment during the past 6 months." He slowly turned back toward the table. 43 people heard the same sound. He paused. Only one person stood up. The room remained still. Victoria broke the silence first. "She repaired your faucet?" Adrian nodded. Without asking for recognition. Without believing anyone was watching. She assumed responsibility before she assumed authority. Marcus leaned forward. "Adrian, with respect, repairing plumbing does not qualify someone to run operations for a corporation of this size." "No," Adrian agreed. "Character does not guarantee competence." Marcus relaxed slightly. "Exactly," Adrian continued before anyone else could speak. "But competence without character eventually becomes expensive." That sentence lingered over the room. Adrian returned to the table and rested one hand on Naomi's resume. "Every building we own exists because thousands of people trust us with the place they call home. We can teach software. We can teach financial systems. We can teach corporate processes. It is much harder to teach someone to care about a problem before it becomes their responsibility." Olivia finally spoke. "What are you proposing?" Adrian met her eyes. "I want Naomi Brooks appointed as Director of Community Operations." Several voices overlapped at once. Marcus raised his hand. The board of directors will never approve that appointment. Victoria nodded. Neither will our institutional investors. Marcus looked directly at Adrian. You have 48 hours before Thursday's governance meeting. If you intend to present this recommendation, you need considerably stronger evidence than a repaired faucet. Adrian remained completely composed. Then I have 48 hours. As the meeting adjourned, executives quietly collected their papers, many exchanging uncertain glances. Some believed Adrian had become sentimental. Others wondered whether there were qualifications missing from the resume. Olivia remained behind after everyone else left. She walked beside Adrian toward the elevator before asking softly, "Are you absolutely certain about this?" Adrian looked out across the city where hundreds of construction cranes stretched above the skyline. "No," he admitted honestly. "That is why I intend to find out who Naomi Brooks really is before I ask anyone else to believe what I already suspect." Neither of them noticed the conference room door had failed to latch completely, leaving it open just enough for someone in the hallway to overhear the final words, and within minutes, whispers began traveling through the headquarters that the billionaire chief executive officer was risking his reputation for an unknown single mother no one had ever heard of. By the following morning, Naomi Brooks had almost convinced herself to stop checking her phone every few minutes. Experience had taught her that companies rarely called quickly unless something had gone wrong. She dropped Ethan off at school just before 8 o'clock, kneeling to straighten the collar of his blue jacket before handing him his lunchbox. "You forgot your math folder," she said, pulling it from her tote bag. Ethan grinned sheepishly. "I knew you would remember." Naomi smiled. "That is because somebody around here has to." He hugged her tightly before running toward the school entrance, then suddenly turned back. "Mom." "Yes. If they do not pick you, somebody else will." She watched him disappear through the front doors before quietly whispering, "I hope you are right." Instead of going home, Naomi drove across town to Lincoln Gardens, the aging apartment community where she had worked for nearly 8 years before ownership changed hands. She no longer worked there, but old habits were difficult to leave behind. Mrs. Delgado, an 80-year-old resident with silver hair and a bright yellow cardigan, waved excitedly from her first-floor porch. "Naomi," she called. "My favorite problem solver is back." Naomi laughed as she walked over. "What happened this time?" Mrs. Delgado pointed toward a loose porch railing. "It has been wobbling since Sunday. Maintenance says they are backed up until next week." Naomi tested the railing carefully before kneeling beside it. "Do you still keep that screwdriver in the flower pot?" Mrs. Delgado smiled proudly. "Exactly where you told me." 15 minutes later, the railing stood firm again. Mrs. Delgado reached into her purse, pulling out a folded $20 bill. Naomi gently pushed her hand back. "Absolutely not." "Then let me bake you a pie." "Now that," Naomi said with a smile, "is a much better deal." As they laughed together, neither woman noticed a dark sedan parked quietly across the street. Inside, Adrian Carter watched through the windshield without saying a word. He had arrived 20 minutes earlier expecting to spend only a few minutes observing from a distance before leaving. Instead, he had watched Naomi greet nearly every resident by name. She stopped to carry groceries for a retired veteran whose knees made stairs difficult. She tightened the loose wheel on a little girl's bicycle using tools from her own trunk. She patiently explained to a young father how to reset a tripped electrical breaker instead of doing it for him. No cameras, no interviews, no audience. Every small act looked exactly like the one she had performed inside his apartment. Olivia Grant sat in the passenger seat, following Adrian's gaze. "How often does she come here?" she asked quietly. Adrian nodded toward Mrs. Delgado. "I asked around before you arrived. And she has not worked here in almost a year." Olivia looked surprised. "Then why is she back?" Adrian watched Naomi wave goodbye before crossing the courtyard toward another building. "Apparently, every Wednesday she checks on the elderly residents who live alone." Olivia lowered her notebook. "That is not listed anywhere in her employment history." "No." "Did anyone ask her to do it?" Adrian shook his head. "No one." They remained inside the parked car as Naomi disappeared into building C carrying a toolbox over one shoulder. 25 minutes later, she emerged beside a young maintenance technician who looked barely 20 years old. Adrian watched the conversation from a distance. The young man spoke nervously while Naomi listened without interrupting. She pointed toward an outdoor water valve, demonstrated something with her hands, then stepped back and allowed him to complete the repair himself. When he finished, his face lit up with quiet pride. Naomi applauded once before climbing into her aging sedan. Interesting, Olivia murmured. Adrian glanced toward her. What? She does not solve every problem herself. Adrian continued watching Naomi drive away. No. Olivia smiled thoughtfully. She teaches other people to solve them. Adrian rested both hands on the steering wheel. That is leadership. His phone vibrated. The caller identification displayed Marcus Holloway. Adrian answered immediately. Marcus wasted no time. We have a problem. Adrian's expression hardened. What happened? Somebody leaked information from yesterday's meeting. Adrian looked out at the nearly empty apartment courtyard where Naomi had spent her morning helping people who could offer her nothing in return. How bad? Marcus exhaled heavily. 3 board members have already called me. They want to know why the chief executive officer is personally investigating an unknown single mother instead of interviewing qualified executives. Adrian remained silent. Marcus continued. Thursday's meeting is no longer just about hiring a director. Another pause followed. Now it is about your judgment. Adrian slowly looked back toward the road where Naomi's old sedan had disappeared around the corner. 48 hours had suddenly become much shorter than they had seemed yesterday, and for the first time since beginning his unusual interview process, he realized that proving Naomi deserved the opportunity might not be enough. He might first have to prove that he deserved to keep the authority to give it. Thursday morning arrived beneath a gray Chicago sky that seemed to press lower with every passing hour. Naomi stood in line at a neighborhood grocery store with a gallon of milk, a loaf of whole wheat bread, and Ethan's asthma prescription waiting behind the pharmacy counter. She checked her bank balance twice before sliding her debit card into the reader. Approved. Relief washed over her so quietly that no one around her noticed. Every successful payment had become its own small victory. As she stepped outside carrying 2 reusable bags, her phone buzzed. The caller identification displayed an unfamiliar number from downtown Chicago. Her heartbeat quickened. Hello, this is Naomi Brooks. Ms. Brooks, this is Olivia Grant from Carter Urban Development. Naomi stopped walking. Good morning. Olivia's voice remained warm but professional. Mr. Carter asked me to call personally. We are still completing our evaluation process. We expect a final decision after today's governance meeting. Naomi smiled despite herself. Thank you for letting me know. Olivia hesitated before continuing. There is something else you should probably hear from us rather than someone else. Naomi's expression slowly changed. What happened? Olivia chose her words carefully. Information regarding your interview has circulated inside the company. Some inaccurate assumptions are being made. Naomi felt her stomach tighten. What kind of assumptions? Another brief silence followed. Some people believe you received special treatment because Mr. Carter interviewed you privately. Naomi closed her eyes for a moment. I understand. I wanted you to know none of this came from him. I believe that. Olivia lowered her voice. Regardless of today's outcome, please remember that your conduct during the interview has been spoken of with genuine respect. Naomi thanked her quietly before ending the call. For several seconds, she remained standing on the sidewalk while morning traffic moved steadily around her. Then she simply adjusted the grocery bags in her hands and began walking home. She had spent too many years allowing rumors to steal energy she needed for real problems. Across the city, however, rumors were no longer remaining inside office hallways. Marcus Holloway entered Adrian Carter's office carrying a tablet already displaying several business news websites. It spread faster than we expected, he said grimly. Adrian looked up from his desk. One headline immediately caught his attention. Billionaire Chief Executive Officer raises questions after secret apartment interview. Another article suggested favoritism. A financial blog questioned whether corporate hiring standards were being ignored. None of the stories contained outright accusations, yet each invited readers to reach uncomfortable conclusions. Adrian set the tablet down carefully. Has anyone contacted the board? Marcus nodded. Every member. The investors? Several. Adrian looked toward the city skyline beyond his office windows. And the employees? Marcus gave a tired smile. Everyone has a theory. Before Adrian could answer, his assistant appeared at the door. Sir, the governance committee has moved today's meeting forward by 1 hour. Adrian glanced at the clock. Why? The board chair requested additional discussion before the market closes. After she left, Marcus folded his arms. This is no longer only about Naomi Brooks. Adrian nodded slowly. I know. Some directors believe you have become emotionally invested. Adrian remained silent. Marcus continued, his tone measured rather than critical. You built this company by making disciplined decisions. If they begin questioning your judgment, every major initiative becomes harder to approve. Adrian appreciated Marcus because he always spoke honestly, even when honesty was uncomfortable. Do you think they are wrong? Marcus considered the question. I think you see something in her that the rest of us have not seen yet. Adrian stood and walked toward the window. Then perhaps the problem is not what I see. Marcus waited. Adrian continued quietly. Perhaps the problem is what everyone else refuses to notice. Meanwhile, Naomi unlocked the door to her modest apartment just as Ethan rushed toward her after school. Mom! He wrapped his arms around her waist before noticing her thoughtful expression. Did they call? Naomi knelt beside him with a reassuring smile that had far more uncertainty than she wanted him to see. Not yet, buddy. Ethan studied her face with the remarkable perception children sometimes possessed. You are worried. Naomi brushed a hand across his cheek. A little. Ethan disappeared into his bedroom for a moment before returning with a small plastic toolbox covered in faded superhero stickers. He placed it gently into her hands. Grandpa gave me this before I was born, he said. You always say fixing things is easier when you have the right tools. Naomi felt her eyes sting unexpectedly. Inside the box rested nothing expensive, only a worn screwdriver, a tape measure, and an old adjustable wrench whose handle had faded from years of use. She smiled through the emotion rising in her chest. Thank you. Ethan grinned. Maybe they just need more time to figure out what you already know how to do. Naomi hugged her son tightly, unaware that only a few miles away, Adrian Carter was walking into the most important meeting of his career, carrying nothing except her resume and the conviction that before the day ended, he might be forced to choose between protecting his position or defending the woman everyone else had already decided did not belong. The boardroom doors closed with a muted click that seemed louder than usual. 12 directors sat around the polished oak table while the Chicago skyline shimmered behind them beneath heavy afternoon clouds. Adrian Carter remained standing instead of taking his seat. Naomi Brooks's resume rested quietly in front of every board member, untouched by most of them. Board Chair Eleanor Whitmore folded her hands. Before we begin the formal agenda, we need to address the concerns surrounding your recommended appointment. Adrian nodded. I expected as much. Eleanor studied him for a moment. Several directors believe this hiring decision exposes unnecessary risk. We are prepared to hear your reasoning. Adrian reached for Naomi's file, but before he could speak, Marcus Holloway cleared his throat. Madam Chair, there is something you should probably see first. Every eye turned toward him. Marcus connected his laptop to the large conference screen. After yesterday's discussion, I asked compliance to conduct a deeper review of Ms. Brooks's employment history. Not because I doubted her integrity, but because I wanted complete information. A spreadsheet briefly appeared before giving way to maintenance records dating back almost 7 years. Marcus continued. At first glance, her resume looks ordinary. It is what we found underneath that surprised us. Adrian looked up, genuinely curious. Marcus clicked again. Photographs filled the screen. Aging apartment buildings. Winter storms. Broken water mains. Residents gathered outside temporary shelters. 7 years ago, Lincoln Gardens experienced a major water system failure during one of the coldest weeks of January. Marcus spoke calmly while scrolling through archived reports. Temperatures fell below 10 degrees Fahrenheit. More than 300 apartments lost heat after several pipes froze simultaneously. Several directors leaned closer. Marcus continued. Insurance investigators later concluded that widespread structural damage was avoided because temporary water lines were installed before additional pipes burst. Another document appeared. Maintenance Supervisor Incident Report, prepared by Naomi Brooks. Adrian quietly read the report as it appeared. Naomi had organized volunteer maintenance crews, coordinated local hardware suppliers willing to extend emergency credit, arranged temporary heaters for elderly residents, and created handwritten apartment maps identifying families with infants, medical equipment, or mobility challenges. Everything had been completed overnight. Eleanor adjusted her glasses. Who authorized all of this? Marcus looked toward another page. No one. The room became noticeably quieter. The property management company had already gone home because roads were nearly impassable. Ms. Brooks made the decisions herself. Victoria Lawson frowned thoughtfully. Did she violate company policy? Marcus smiled faintly. Technically, yes. A few surprised expressions appeared around the table. She exceeded spending authority by $8,400. Adrian finally spoke. Then why was she not terminated? Marcus opened one final report. Because her actions prevented an estimated $1.6 million in property damage. Silence settled heavily across the room. Marcus continued. The ownership group reimbursed every expense and later adopted her emergency response procedures across all 27 properties. Adrian slowly looked back down at Naomi's resume. None of that remarkable story appeared anywhere on its single page. There was only one simple bullet point. Managed emergency property operations. Eleanor remained thoughtful. Why was this never publicized? Marcus answered quietly. According to former employees we interviewed this morning, Ms. Brooks refused any recognition. She insisted the maintenance team deserved the credit. Adrian felt something shift inside him. Until this moment, even he had underestimated her. He had admired the woman who quietly repaired a faucet. He had not yet known about the woman who quietly protected hundreds of families during a winter emergency. Eleanor folded her hands once more. Anything else? Marcus hesitated before clicking one final photograph onto the screen. It showed Naomi standing beside several young maintenance workers holding newly earned certification certificates. Everyone in the picture was smiling except Naomi, who stood off to the side clapping proudly for them. Employee retention in her department remained the highest in the company's history, Marcus explained. When interviewed yesterday, 6 former employees independently said nearly identical words. He looked down at his notes before reading them aloud. She never fixed our problems for us. She taught us how to fix them ourselves. Adrian remembered watching Naomi guide the young maintenance technician outside Lincoln Gardens only 2 days earlier. Suddenly, the moment carried an entirely different meaning. It had not been an isolated act. It had been the pattern of an entire career. Before anyone could speak again, the conference room doors opened unexpectedly. Adrian's assistant stepped inside, her usually composed expression replaced by visible concern. I am sorry to interrupt. She looked directly at Eleanor. There is an urgent matter. Eleanor frowned. What is it? The assistant swallowed carefully. Several major investors have requested an emergency conference call within the hour. They have seen the media coverage and want to know whether the board intends to support Mr. Carter's recommendation or overrule it. The room fell silent once again. The decision was no longer an internal hiring discussion. Within the next hour, every choice made inside this room could shape not only Naomi Brooks's future, but Adrian Carter's leadership and the reputation of the company he had spent his life building. The investor conference call began precisely at 3 o'clock. Faces appeared one by one across the massive screen at the front of the boardroom, representing pension funds, charitable foundations, and institutional firms that collectively own nearly 40% of Carter Urban Development. Adrian remained standing near the head of the table, while Eleanor Whitmore formally welcomed everyone. There was little ceremony. Everyone understood why they were there. Richard Lawson, managing partner of one of the company's largest investment groups, spoke first. Mr. Carter, the headlines suggest you intend to appoint an inexperienced candidate to a critical executive position. We would like to understand your reasoning before rumors begin affecting confidence. Adrian nodded once. That is fair. He reached into his briefcase and removed a small flash drive. Before I answer your question, I would like to show you something. He inserted the drive into the conference room computer. Instead of financial charts or market forecasts, security footage appeared on the screen. The recording showed the entrance of Adrian's apartment on the morning Naomi arrived for her interview. There was no dramatic music, no narration, only ordinary sounds. The elevator doors opened. Naomi stepped inside carrying a worn leather folder against her chest. She paused politely after hearing the faint dripping sound. Adrian's recorded image disappeared down the hallway, leaving her alone. For nearly 30 seconds, she simply stood there, uncertain whether to move. She even called his name before carefully walking toward the kitchen. One investor leaned closer to the screen. Naomi opened the cabinet beneath the sink. She found the toolbox. She removed only the wrench she needed. She repaired the faucet with practiced movements before wiping every drop of water from the countertop. Then she returned the wrench to exactly the same place, closed the cabinet, picked up her folder, and quietly walked back toward the living room. She never looked toward the hidden camera. She never smiled proudly. She never behaved as though anyone might reward her. The video ended. Silence settled across both the boardroom and the conference call. Adrian waited several seconds before speaking. Every person you just watched believed they were completely alone. A puzzled investor interrupted. Every person? Adrian nodded. That faucet has been leaking for 6 months. 43 executive candidates heard exactly the same sound. Another pause followed. Only one repaired it. Richard Lawson folded his hands thoughtfully. You based your hiring recommendation on a plumbing repair? Adrian smiled gently. No. He looked around the room. I based it on responsibility. He walked toward the large windows overlooking Chicago before continuing. Our company builds affordable housing. Every decision we make eventually affects families we will never meet. We often tell ourselves that leadership begins when someone gives us authority. I disagree. He turned back toward the investors. Leadership begins the moment someone notices a problem and quietly decides it belongs to them. Marcus Holloway watched Adrian carefully. For the first time since the controversy began, he realized Adrian was no longer defending Naomi Brooks. He was defending the culture he wanted the company to become. Adrian continued. Many candidates possessed stronger resumes. Some graduated from prestigious universities. Some managed larger budgets. I respect every one of them. But Naomi Brooks has already spent years making difficult decisions that protected families, trained future leaders, and accepted responsibility long before anyone offered recognition. Eleanor added calmly. Our independent review confirmed those facts this morning. Adrian nodded gratefully before continuing. Skills can be taught. Character rarely can. If we say our mission is improving communities, then we must eventually choose leaders who already live that mission before we place it inside a mission statement. Richard Lawson remained silent for several moments before asking one final question. Mr. Carter, if this appointment creates criticism, falling stock prices, or pressure on your own position as chief executive officer, will you still support this decision? Every eye in the room shifted toward Adrian. His answer came without hesitation. Yes. Even if the board asks you to reconsider? Yes. Even if it costs you personally? Adrian remembered his father tightening leaking pipes inside homes where no one could afford to pay him. He remembered Malcolm Carter's quiet words from years ago. Promise me you will help somebody else when it is your turn. Adrian looked directly into the camera. If we only make the right decision when it is convenient, then it was never the right decision at all. No one spoke after that. Richard Lawson slowly nodded before muting his microphone. One by one, the other investors exchanged thoughtful glances instead of objections. Around the boardroom table, the atmosphere had changed almost imperceptibly. Doubt had not disappeared completely, but something stronger had begun replacing it. Respect. Eleanor Whitmore quietly gathered her notes before looking around the room. Very well, she said. The board will now proceed to the final vote. Hundreds of miles away, completely unaware that her future was being decided at that exact moment, Naomi sat beside Ethan at their small kitchen table, helping him build a model bridge for his science assignment. As she held one end steady while he carefully glued the final support into place, neither of them knew that within the next few minutes, another bridge was about to be built, one connecting two very different worlds through something far stronger than wealth, titles, or perfect resumes. The electronic voting screen remained blank for what felt like an eternity before Eleanor Whitmore finally pressed the button that revealed the result. 8 votes in favor. 4 against. The motion carried. No one applauded. There was only a quiet stillness that often followed decisions capable of changing many lives at once. Adrian Carter slowly released a breath he had not realized he had been holding. Marcus Holloway closed his notebook with a small nod of respect, while Olivia Grant allowed herself the first genuine smile she had worn all afternoon. Eleanor looked toward Adrian. The board has approved your recommendation. Naomi Brooks will be offered the position of Director of Community Operations effective immediately. Adrian thanked every director before gathering the folder that had traveled with him through the most difficult 48 hours of his professional life. As the meeting ended, Richard Lawson remained on the conference screen for one final moment. "Mr. Carter," he said, "today you reminded us that quarterly reports measure performance, but character determines whether performance lasts. I hope your confidence is rewarded." Adrian answered simply, "So do I." Less than an hour later, a black company sedan stopped in front of Naomi's modest apartment building. She had just finished washing the dinner dishes while Ethan proudly displayed the completed bridge for his science class. The unexpected knock at the door made both of them look toward the hallway. Naomi opened the door to find Adrian standing beside Olivia, both dressed exactly as they had been during the board meeting. For a brief second, no one spoke. Naomi searched their expressions, trying to prepare herself for disappointment. Adrian noticed the old toolbox resting on the kitchen table beside Ethan's school project and smiled almost imperceptibly. "May we come in?" Naomi stepped aside immediately. The apartment was small, warm, and filled with signs of ordinary life. Family photographs lined a narrow bookshelf. A backpack rested beside the couch. The faint smell of homemade chicken soup lingered in the air. Ethan looked curiously toward the strangers before politely introducing himself. Adrian shook the boy's hand. "Your mother tells me you are very good at solving problems." Ethan grinned. "She says every problem is smaller if you start early." Adrian glanced toward Naomi. "She is right." Olivia handed Naomi a sealed envelope bearing the company logo. Naomi accepted it carefully, but did not open it right away. Adrian noticed. "Are not you curious?" Naomi smiled nervously. "I am just trying to enjoy the moment before I know the answer." Adrian laughed softly. "Then let me save you the suspense." He waited until she looked directly at him. "Congratulations, Ms. Brooks. The position is yours, if you still want it." Naomi stared at him without speaking. Her fingers trembled slightly as she finally opened the envelope. The official offer letter rested inside, complete with salary, benefits, and a handwritten note at the bottom signed by Adrian himself. "Welcome to Carter Urban Development. Thank you for reminding us what leadership looks like." Naomi covered her mouth as quiet tears filled her eyes. They were not tears of disbelief alone. They carried months of uncertainty, years of sacrifice, and countless mornings spent wondering whether anyone would ever notice the invisible work she had done her entire life. Ethan looked back and forth between them before asking the only question that mattered to him. "Does this mean Mom got the job?" Adrian smiled. "Yes." Ethan threw his arms around Naomi so quickly that she almost dropped the letter. His laughter filled the apartment, light enough to wash away every anxious day that had come before it. 1 year later, the lobby of Carter Urban Development looked very different. A new leadership program had expanded opportunities for employees whose talent could not always be measured by impressive titles or prestigious degrees. Community partnerships had doubled. Employee retention reached the highest level in company history. More importantly, hundreds of affordable housing residents now benefited from preventive maintenance initiatives inspired by ideas Naomi had quietly practiced for years. On a bright spring morning, Naomi walked through headquarters carrying a folder when she heard a familiar sound. Drip, drip, drip. She stopped outside a small employee break room. A young intern looked around uncertainly after noticing the leaking faucet. He quietly set down his coffee, opened the cabinet beneath the sink, found a wrench, and carefully tightened the loose fitting before wiping the countertop clean. He never realized anyone had been watching. Naomi smiled, but said nothing. A moment later, Adrian appeared beside her. "You saw him too?" he asked quietly. Naomi nodded. "Do you think he was trying to impress someone?" Adrian looked through the doorway where the young employee had already returned to work. "No," he answered with quiet satisfaction. "I think he was simply fixing a problem." They stood together for another moment as complete silence settled over the room. The faucet no longer leaked. Neither, in its own way, did the culture of the company. Sometimes the smallest repairs changed far more than a single broken thing. Sometimes they reminded people who they had always been capable of becoming. And sometimes the first person willing to fix what everyone else ignored became the reason countless others started doing the same.